They arrived in November 1945, exhausted and trembling, their thin coats doing little against the cold Oklahoma wind. The women were young, most in their early 20s, their faces hollowed by months of retreat across a collapsing Europe. They had been radio operators, military clerks, field nurses, parts of a regime that had promised them glory and delivered only ash. As the transport trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Gruber, they braced themselves for what propaganda had burned into their minds: brutality, starvation, chains. What they heard instead, drifting across the November twilight, was music. Not martial drums or screamed commands, but the soft, impossible sound of a clarinet playing jazz. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trucks came to a stop near a cluster of wooden barracks, their engines coughing into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The women sat rigid on the benches, hands clutching worn suitcases or bundled blankets. Then the back gate dropped with a metallic clang, and an American guard stepped forward. He was young, perhaps 25, with a face that showed neither cruelty nor triumph. He simply gestured toward the barracks and said in broken German, "Welcome, you will be safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign. In the Reich, safety had been a promise always deferred, always conditional. Safety came only to the loyal, only to the pure, only to those who never questioned. Yet here, in enemy hands, the word was offered as casually as a handshake. The women filed out slowly, boots crunching against gravel. Their eyes darted around the camp, searching for the horrors they had been trained to expect. Instead, they saw electric lights glowing warmly in windows. They saw other prisoners, men in separate compounds, standing at ease near mess halls. And they saw, in the distance, a small wooden stage being assembled near the central yard. "What is that?" whispered Marguerite, a former Luftwaffe clerk from Dresden. She was 23, with sharp eyes that had once tracked bomber formations on radar screens. Now those eyes widened in confusion as she pointed toward the stage. "I don't know," replied Hilde, a nurse who had stitched wounds in field hospitals from Stalingrad to Berlin. "But it doesn't look like a gallows." The women were led into their barracks, long wooden structures lined with metal bunks. Each bed had a thin but clean mattress, a folded wool blanket, and a pillow. In Germany, such bedding would have been rationed, traded, fought over. Here it was simply provided. As they unpacked their meager belongings, the smell of cooking food drifted through the open windows. Not the watery turnip soup they had survived on during the retreat, but something richer, something that made their stomachs twist with forgotten hunger. Dinner was served in the mess hall an hour later. The women entered cautiously, moving in tight groups as if expecting an ambush. What they found instead were long tables already set with metal trays. American soldiers stood behind serving lines, ladling out portions with mechanical efficiency. Marguerite stepped forward first, holding her tray with both hands. A soldier scooped mashed potatoes onto it, then added a thick slice of meatloaf, green beans glistening with butter, and a piece of white bread. When he reached for a ladle of gravy, Marguerite flinched, certain this was some kind of trick. "Go ahead," the soldier said, his tone neutral. "You'll get seconds if you want." Seconds! The concept seemed absurd. In Berlin, her family had waited hours in ration lines for a single loaf of bread. Her mother had once traded her wedding ring for a can of condensed milk. And here, an enemy soldier was offering her seconds. Marguerite carried her tray to a table and sat down, staring at the food as if it might vanish. Around her, other women did the same, eating slowly at first, then faster as hunger overrode disbelief. "This is better than Christmas dinner," muttered Hilde through a mouthful of potatoes. "Better than anything I've eaten in 3 years." Across the table, a woman named Elsa, a former secretary from Hamburg, shook her head. "It's a trick. They're fattening us up for something. They want us to trust them, then they'll—" "Then they'll what?" Marguerite interrupted, her voice sharp. "Look around, Elsa. Do you see chains? Do you see whips? We've been here 2 hours, and we've had more food than a week in Berlin." Elsa had no answer. None of them did. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, filled with the clinking of forks against metal trays and the quiet hum of electric lights overhead. In Germany, such lights would have been extinguished by now, hidden behind blackout curtains to avoid Allied bombers. Here they burned freely, as if the war had never touched this place. After dinner, the women were led back to their barracks. The guards did not shout or shove. They simply walked alongside, occasionally pointing out the latrines or the infirmary. One guard, a middle-aged man from Iowa, even attempted a joke in halting German. "The coffee here is terrible," he said with a grin, "but it's still better than what you'll find in Berlin." The women didn't laugh. They couldn't. Laughter felt like betrayal, like admitting that captivity might be preferable to freedom under the Reich. Instead, they filed into their barracks and sat on their bunks, staring at the ceiling or at each other, searching for explanations that wouldn't come.
It was Hilde who first noticed the music. She had been lying on her bunk, staring at the wooden beams above, when she heard it, a faint melody drifting through the window. At first, she thought she was imagining it, that hunger and exhaustion had finally broken her mind. But then Marguerite sat up, her head tilted toward the sound. "Do you hear that?" Marguerite whispered. "Yes," Hilda replied. "What is it?" They moved to the window, pressing their faces against the cold glass. Outside, the central yard had transformed. The wooden stage they had seen earlier was now fully assembled, lit by floodlights that cast stark shadows across the gravel. A small band was setting up, a drummer adjusting his kit, a bassist tuning his strings, a pianist running scales on an upright that had been wheeled out from somewhere. And in front of them, testing a microphone, was a woman in a shimmering blue dress. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Americans," Elsa muttered from behind them. "They're putting on a show." "For who?" asked another woman, a young radio operator named Greta. "For themselves?" "No," Marguerite said slowly, her breath fogging the glass. "For us." The realization spread through the barracks like a flame catching dry tinder. Within minutes, every woman was at the windows, staring out at the impossible scene. Some were silent, others whispered theories. A few insisted it was propaganda, a staged performance meant to soften them for interrogation. But as the band began to play, as the woman in the blue dress stepped forward and sang a slow, haunting rendition of "I'll Be Seeing You," all arguments fell away. The music was not propaganda. It was not a weapon or a trick. It was simply music, offered without demand or expectation, and for women who had spent years surrounded by the mechanical roar of war, the scream of dive bombers, the thunder of artillery, the wail of air raid sirens, the sound of a saxophone playing a gentle melody was almost unbearable in its tenderness. Hilde felt something crack inside her chest. She had not cried when her hospital in Stalingrad was overrun. She had not cried when she learned her brother was missing in France. But now, standing at a barracks window in an enemy camp, listening to a song about longing and hope, tears began to stream down her face. "Why are they doing this?" she whispered. Marguerite had no answer. None of them did. The concert became a nightly ritual. Each evening after dinner, the prisoners were allowed to gather in the central yard. There were no forced marches, no mandatory attendance. The guards simply opened the barracks doors and let the women choose. At first, only a few ventured out, sitting on benches at the back of the crowd, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But danger never came. Instead, there was only music. The performers varied. Some nights it was a military band playing swing standards. Other nights it was a solo guitarist strumming folk songs. Occasionally, prisoners from the male compounds were allowed to perform. their voices rising in German hymns or Alpine ballads that brought gasps of recognition from the women. And once, on a cold December evening, a Red Cross volunteer sang Silent Night in both German and English, her voice bridging a divide that barbed wire could not. Marguerite attended every concert. She told herself it was curiosity, that she was simply observing enemy behavior for some future report. But the truth, which she could not yet admit, was that the music had become a lifeline. Each note was proof that the world still held beauty, that somewhere, beneath the rubble and blood, humanity endured. One night, a jazz quartet took the stage. The pianist was a black American soldier, his fingers dancing across the keys with effortless grace. Marguerite watched transfixed. In the Reich, she had been taught that people of his race were inferior, incapable of culture or art. But here he was, creating music so complex and beautiful that it left her breathless. The dissonance between what she had been taught and what she now witnessed was dizzying. Beside her, Greta leaned over and whispered, "How can they do this? We're at war. Their brothers are dying in Europe, yet they give us music?" Marguerite didn't answer immediately. She watched the pianist finish his solo, watched the crowd, guards and prisoners alike, erupt in applause. Finally, she said, "Maybe they're not like us. Maybe they don't need to hate to fight." The idea was heretical. The Reich had built itself on the necessity of hatred, on the belief that strength came from purity and division. But here, in this camp, hatred seemed absent. The guards did not sneer at the prisoners. They did not mock or demean. They simply did their jobs. And in their spare time, they played music. Statistics told part of the story. By the end of 1945, over 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. The Geneva Convention mandated humane treatment, but America went beyond mere compliance. Prisoners received the same rations as American soldiers, 4,000 calories per day, including meat, dairy, fresh vegetables, and even desserts. They had access to education, recreation, and religious services. Many camps, like Gruber, organized sports leagues, theater productions, and yes, concerts. But numbers alone could not capture the psychological impact. For women who had lived under a regime that weaponized scarcity, that rationed not just food, but joy itself, the abundance of American captivity was a form of warfare more effective than any bomb. It did not destroy their bodies, it dismantled their beliefs. Until the Battle of the Bulge.
The concerts became a gathering point for more than entertainment. They became a place where conversations happened, where doubts were voiced in the safety of darkness and music. One evening, as a country band played a lively tune, Hild turned to Marguerite and said, "My sister wrote to me. She said Berlin is starving. She said they're eating rats." Marguerite nodded slowly. "My mother wrote the same. She asked me to send food." "How do we send food?" Hild asked, her voice breaking. "We're prisoners, and yet we eat better than they do." The paradox was unbearable. They were captives, stripped of freedom, and yet they lived in greater comfort than the citizens of their own nation. The realization did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, night after night, carried on the wings of saxophone solos and piano ballads. Each concert was a reminder that the world they had believed in, a world where Germany was strong, where the Reich would triumph, where their sacrifices meant something, was a lie. Elsa still resisted. She sat at the edge of the crowds, arms crossed, refusing to enjoy the music. "It's manipulation," she hissed to anyone who would listen. "They want us weak. They want us to forget who we are." But even Elsa's resolve began to crack. One night, a violinist played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata,
and Elsa wept. She tried to hide it, turning her face away, but Marguerite saw, and in that moment she understood. The music was not making them weak, it was making them human again. By mid-December, the nightly concerts had become so popular that the camp expanded the seating area. Benches were brought in from storage. Some prisoners brought blankets and sat on the ground. The guards, too, attended in growing numbers, standing at the edges with their rifles slung, not as threats, but as spectators. Occasionally, a guard would nod along to the beat or tap his foot. Once, during a particularly lively swing number, a young guard from Texas actually danced, spinning his rifle like a baton, until his sergeant barked at him to stop. The women laughed. It was the first time many of them had laughed in years. And in that laughter, something shifted. They were still prisoners. The war was still real. But in this camp, in this moment, they were allowed to be something other than soldiers or victims. They were allowed to be people. Marguerite began writing letters home, though she knew they would be censored. She described the concerts in careful language, avoiding anything that might sound like praise for the enemy. "We are treated adequately," she wrote. "There is entertainment provided." But her mother, reading between the lines, understood. In her reply, she wrote, "I am glad you are safe. I wish I could hear music again." That line haunted Marguerite. Her mother, who had once played piano in their Dresden apartment, who had filled their home with Schubert and Brahms, now lived in silence. The pianos had been sold for food. The concert halls bombed into rubble. Music, which had once been Germany's pride, was now a luxury only the defeated could afford in American captivity. The irony was not lost on her. She had grown up believing Germany was the pinnacle of culture, the guardian of civilization. But here, in a camp run by Americans, people the Reich had dismissed as crude and uncultured, she found more art, more beauty, more humanity than she had ever known at home. One night, after a particularly moving performance of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, Marguerite approached one of the guards. He was a young man, perhaps 22, with a kind face, and a rifle he clearly had no intention of using. She asked, "Why do you do this? Why the music?" The guard looked surprised by the question. He thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I guess because you're people," he said simply, "and people need music." It was not a grand answer. It was not philosophical or strategic, but its simplicity struck Marguerite like a blow. In the Reich, people were not just people. They were Aryans or subhumans, useful or expendable, loyal or traitors. The idea that humanity itself was enough, that no further justification was needed, was revolutionary. She walked back to her barracks in a daze. That night, lying in her bunk, she stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things she had believed. She thought about the rallies in Nuremberg, where thousands had chanted in unison. She thought about the films that promised victory and glory. She thought about the teachers who had told her she was part of a master race destined to rule. And she thought about the guard who had said, simply, that she was a person who needed music. One of these worldviews had fed her. The other had starved her. One had given her music. The other had given her only the roar of war. As December wore on, the concerts grew more elaborate. A Christmas special was planned, complete with a full orchestra assembled from military musicians stationed nearby. Rumors spread through the camp that there would be gifts, that Red Cross packages would be distributed, and that the meal on Christmas Eve would include turkey and pies. The women didn't know whether to believe it. Gifts for prisoners? It seemed absurd. Yet everything about this captivity had been absurd. They had been fed when they expected starvation. They had been treated with respect when they expected brutality. And they had been given music when they expected only silence.
On the night of the Christmas concert, the temperature dropped below freezing. The camp administration set up portable heaters around the yard and distributed extra blankets. The women bundled up and filed out, their breath misting in the cold air.
The stage was decorated with evergreen branches and strings of electric lights that glowed like stars. The orchestra began with "O Holy Night," the melody swelling across the camp. Then came carols, both American and German, sung by a choir assembled from volunteers. When they reached Stille Nacht, every woman in the audience joined in. Their voices rose together, tentative at first, then stronger, filling the frozen night with a song that belonged to no nation, only to memory and longing. Marguerite sang through her tears. Beside her, Hilda clutched her hand. Even Elsa, sitting at the back with her arms still crossed, mouthed the words. In that moment, they were not prisoners or enemies. They were simply people, far from home, sharing a song that reminded them of what they had lost and what, perhaps, they might still reclaim. After the concert, as promised, Red Cross packages were distributed. Each woman received a small box containing chocolate, cigarettes, soap, and a handwritten Christmas card from an anonymous American donor. Marguerite opened hers with shaking hands. The card read, "Merry Christmas. May you find peace." She had not expected kindness. She had not expected gifts. And she certainly had not expected an enemy to wish her peace. Yet here it was, in her hands, undeniable and real. That night, as the women returned to their barracks, the conversations were different. The arguments about loyalty and ideology had faded. In their place was something quieter, something more dangerous to the worldview they had been raised in. Doubt. Not angry doubt, but the kind that comes from seeing an alternative, from realizing that the life you were promised was not the only life possible. "What if we were wrong?" Greta whispered into the darkness. No one answered, but no one needed to. The question hung in the air, unanswered but undeniable, carried on the fading echoes of Christmas carols and the memory of a guard who believed they were people who needed music. And outside, in the cold Oklahoma night, the stage lights were finally turned off. But the music lingered, not in the air, but in the minds of women who were beginning to understand that captivity could teach them more about freedom than their homeland ever had. The new year arrived with unexpected warmth, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. By January 1946, the concerts had evolved from mere entertainment into something far more profound. They had become a bridge between worlds, a space where ideology dissolved into melody, and where enemies discovered they were simply people separated by circumstance rather than nature. Marguerite found herself volunteering to help set up chairs before each performance. It gave her something to do, a purpose beyond the endless waiting that defined camp life. But more than that, it allowed her to observe the American soldiers up close, to study the enemy she had been taught to hate and fear. What she discovered unsettled her more than any propaganda ever had. They were ordinary men, tired from their own war, homesick for their own families, finding solace in the same music that comforted her. One afternoon, while arranging benches near the stage, she struck up a conversation with a guard named Corporal James Morrison from Pennsylvania. He was setting up microphone stands, humming absently to himself as he worked. Marguerite recognized the tune "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," a song she had heard at one of the previous concerts. "You like music?" she asked in careful English, her accent thick but comprehensible. Morrison looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. "Yeah," he said, breaking into a smile. "My mother was a piano teacher back home. Music's about the only thing that makes sense anymore." "In Germany," Marguerite said slowly, choosing her words with care, "we also loved music. Before the war. Beethoven, Wagner, Brahms. Now there is only silence." Morrison nodded, his expression thoughtful. "War takes a lot of things. But it can't take what we remember, I guess. That's why we do this." He gestured toward the stage. "Colonel Hendricks, he's the camp commander. He believes music keeps us all human, prisoners and guards alike." The simplicity of that philosophy struck Marguerite like a physical blow. Music keeps us human, not propaganda, not ideology, not racial purity or national glory, just music, just the acknowledgement of shared humanity. It was so different from everything the Reich had taught, where humanity itself was conditional, earned through loyalty and blood. That evening's concert featured a special guest, a German prisoner from the male compound, a former music professor from Leipzig, named Klaus Werner. He had been captured in France and had spent the past year in various American camps. Now, with special permission, he stood on the stage with a violin tucked under his chin, his hands steady despite months of captivity. The women watched in breathless silence as he raised the bow. What emerged was not a German military march or a Nazi anthem, but Bach's Chaconne in D minor, a piece so profound, so achingly beautiful that it transcended all borders and ideologies. For 15 minutes, the camp disappeared. There was no barbed wire, no guards, no war. There was only the music, speaking a language older and truer than any political doctrine. When he finished, the silence lasted several heartbeats before applause erupted. But it was different from previous nights. There was something sacred in it, a reverence that went beyond mere appreciation. Hildit, sitting beside Marguerite, covered her face with her hands and sobbed quietly. Around them, other women wept openly, no longer ashamed of their tears. "Why does it hurt so much?" Hilda whispered. "It's beautiful, but it hurts."
Margarita understood. The music hurt because it reminded them of what they had lost, not just in the war, but before it. A Germany that had once produced Bach and Beethoven, a nation of poets and composers, now reduced to ruins and hatred. The music hurt because it showed them what they could have been if they had chosen a different path. After the performance, Klaus Werner was allowed to stay for a brief conversation with some of the women, supervised by guards, but not restricted. He sat on the edge of the stage, his violin resting beside him, and spoke quietly with those who approached. "How can you play like that?" asked Greta, the young radio operator. "After everything, after losing the war, after captivity, how?" Klaus smiled sadly. "Because music is the only truth I have left," he said. "Everything else was a lie. The Reich, the promises, the glory, all lies. But Bach was real 500 years ago, and he is real now. That cannot be taken from us." His words spread through the barracks that night like wildfire. They were not words of defiance or political resistance. They were something more dangerous. Words of acceptance, of letting go, of recognizing that the world they had believed in was built on foundations of sand. Elsa, who had resisted so fiercely, finally broke. She approached Margarita one evening after a concert and said, voice trembling, "I don't know what to believe anymore. If we were lied to about America, about the war, about everything, then who am I? What was I fighting for?" It was the question they all carried, but few dared to voice. The concerts had not given them answers. Instead, they had stripped away the certainty that had armored them against doubt. And in that vulnerable space, transformation became possible. The letters from home grew more desperate as winter deepened. Marguerite's mother wrote about standing in bread lines for 6 hours, only to be turned away empty-handed. Hilda received word that her younger sister had died of pneumonia, unable to access medicine or proper heating. Greta learned that her family's apartment building in Hamburg had been requisitioned by occupation forces, leaving her parents homeless. Each letter was a knife twist, a reminder of the terrible irony of their situation. They sat in warm barracks, ate 3 meals a day, and attended concerts while their families suffered in the very homeland they had been taught to revere. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. "We are better off as prisoners than they are as free citizens," Margarita said one night, staring at her mother's latest letter. The words felt like treason, but they were undeniably true. The American authorities seemed aware of this psychological turmoil. In February, they introduced educational programs, voluntary classes in English, American history, and democratic principles. Some prisoners refused to attend, viewing it as indoctrination. But others, hungry for understanding, filled the classrooms. Margarita attended a class on the American Constitution, taught by a spectacled lieutenant from Massachusetts who spoke with genuine passion about individual rights and the separation of powers. She listened with skeptical fascination, trying to reconcile this talk of freedom with the barbed wire that surrounded them. "Why do you tell us this?" she asked one day. "We are your enemies. Why teach us your values?" The lieutenant considered the question carefully. "Because we believe these aren't just American values, they're human values. And we believe that if you understand them, if you see how they work, you might take them back to Germany someday. Help rebuild something better." The audacity of that hope, that they might be agents of change rather than just defeated enemies, was staggering. The Reich had taught them that defeat meant annihilation, that the conquered were crushed beneath the victor's boot. Yet here were their conquerors, investing time and resources into educating them as if they mattered, as if their future had value. But it was still the music that reached deepest. In March, as spring began to thaw the Oklahoma plains, the concerts took on a new character. More prisoners volunteered to perform, women who had sung in church choirs, who had played instruments before the war, who had something to offer beyond their role as defeated enemies. A trio of women formed a small choir, singing German folk songs with three-part harmony that brought tears to everyone who listened. Their voices, untrained but heartfelt, carried melodies from a Germany that had existed before the Third Reich. Songs about mountains and rivers, love and loss, seasons and homecomings. These were not Nazi songs, not martial anthems of conquest, but the music of ordinary people. And in singing them, the women reclaimed something that had been stolen from them, their cultural heritage divorced from political horror. The American soldiers listened with respect, some even nodding along to unfamiliar melodies. And in that reciprocal appreciation, Americans honoring German culture, Germans marveling at American generosity, something remarkable happened. The walls between captor and captive, between enemy and enemy, began to crumble in ways that treaties and surrender documents never could. One particularly memorable evening in April featured a joint performance. American soldiers and German POWs together on stage, performing a medley of folk songs from both nations. It was controversial. Some guards thought it went too far, blurring lines that should remain clear. Some prisoners refused to participate, seeing it as collaboration with the enemy. But Margarita volunteered. She stood on that stage beside Corporal Morrison, who played guitar, and together with 5 other women and 3 other soldiers, they sang.
After the performance, Morrison turned to Margarita and said, "You have a beautiful voice." "Thank you," she replied, and then, after a pause, "This would have been impossible a year ago." "What would have been impossible?" "Standing beside you, singing together, seeing you as just another person who loves music." Morrison nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess the war is really over when we can do this." But was the war truly over? Physically, yes. Germany had surrendered nearly a year ago. But the war of ideas, the war of beliefs, the war in the minds and hearts of those who had lived through it, that war was still being fought in the quiet spaces between notes, in the shared glances during a violin solo, in the tears that fell during a lullaby. By May 1946, preparations for repatriation began. The women would soon return to Germany, to a homeland transformed beyond recognition. The news spread through the camp with mixed emotions. Some were eager to go home, despite the hardships, desperate to reunite with families. Others dreaded the return, knowing they would be trading warm barracks and full meals for rubble and hunger. The final concerts took on an elegiac quality. Each performance felt like a farewell, not just to the camp, but to a strange interlude where enemy lines had blurred and where humanity had been rediscovered in the most unlikely place. The American soldiers seemed to feel it too. Many had formed unexpected friendships with prisoners, relationships built on shared love of music, on late-night conversations about art and philosophy, on the recognition that beneath uniforms and flags, people were simply people. For the last concert, the camp commander, Colonel Hendricks, stood on stage and addressed the assembled prisoners and guards. He was a tall man with graying hair and a face weathered by 2 wars, and when he spoke, his voice carried both authority and genuine warmth. "Ladies," he began, and the word itself was significant. Not prisoners, not enemies, but ladies. "You will soon return home to begin the difficult work of rebuilding. You will face hardships that we, from this distance, cannot fully comprehend. But I want you to remember something." He paused, looking out across the crowd. "You came here believing certain things about America, about yourselves, about the nature of strength and weakness. I hope that in your time here, some of those beliefs have been challenged, not because we wanted to indoctrinate you, but because we wanted you to see an alternative, a society built on different principles, where diversity is strength, where dissent is not treason, where humanity is not conditional." Some women shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded slowly. Margarita felt her throat tighten. "The music you've heard here," Hendricks continued, "was not a luxury or a propaganda tool. It was a reminder, to you and to us, that civilization survives not through conquest, but through culture, not through domination, but through shared beauty. Take that reminder home with you, and when you rebuild Germany, build something worthy of Bach and Beethoven, worthy of Goethe and Schiller. Build a nation that creates music instead of war." The applause was thunderous, but it was the tears that told the true story. Even some of the guards wiped their eyes. The speech had acknowledged their pain without excusing their past, had offered hope without minimizing the horror of what the Reich had done. That final concert was the most extraordinary. It featured every musician who had performed over the past months: the jazz quartet, the string ensemble, Klaus Werner with his violin, the women's choir, and even some of the guards who played instruments. They performed for 3 hours, moving through genres and eras: Baroque fugues and swing standards, German lieder and American blues, Strauss waltzes and Gershwin rhapsodies. And when it ended, when the last note faded into the spring night, no one moved. The audience sat in silence, unwilling to break the spell, unwilling to acknowledge that this chapter was closing. Finally, slowly, people began to stand, to gather their blankets, and to drift back toward barracks. But the silence remained, heavy with unspoken gratitude and unresolved grief. Margarita walked back with Hilda, neither speaking until they reached their barracks. Then Hilda said, voice barely above a whisper, "I don't want to go home." "I know," Margarita replied. "Neither do I." It was a terrible confession. How could they admit that captivity had felt freer than citizenship, that enemy territory had shown them more humanity than their own nation? But it was true. The concerts had given them something they had never known under the Reich: the permission to be vulnerable, to appreciate beauty without guilt, to recognize shared humanity across enemy lines. The journey home began in mid-June. The women were processed, given new clothes and travel documents, and loaded onto trains that would take them to ships bound for Europe. As Margarita waited in line, she clutched a small notebook, a gift from Corporal Morrison, in which she had written down the names of every piece of music she had heard during her captivity. It was her treasure, her proof that this strange interlude had been real. On the last night before departure, She sat in the empty barracks. Most women had already been transported to the departure point, and wrote a final entry. We came here as believers, convinced of our superiority, our righteousness, our inevitable triumph. We leave here as questioners, uncertain of everything we once knew. The Americans defeated us not with cruelty, but with kindness, not with chains, but with concerts, not by crushing our spirits, but by showing us what our spirits might have been if we had chosen differently.
I do not know what awaits me in Germany. I do not know if I will find my family alive, if I will find work, if I will find a place in a nation that must rebuild itself from ashes. But I know this: I will never forget the sound of a clarinet playing jazz on a November evening, the sight of a black pianist creating beauty with his hands, the feeling of standing on a stage beside my former enemy, singing songs that belonged to everyone and no one. The Reich taught me to hate. America taught me to question. And in questioning, I found something more valuable than any ideology. I found my own voice. She closed the notebook and placed it carefully in her bag, alongside the letters from home and the few personal items she had accumulated. Tomorrow, she would board a train. Next week, she would cross an ocean. And then she would return to a Germany that no longer existed, to build something new from something broken. But tonight, in the quiet barracks, she hummed softly to herself. Not a Nazi anthem, not a military march, but Somewhere Over the Rainbow, a song about hope and dreams, and the possibility of a better world somewhere beyond the storm. The ships that carried them back across the Atlantic were crowded and uncomfortable, nothing like the relative comfort of their American captivity. But the women were different now. They stood on deck as the Statue of Liberty faded in the distance, and some waved, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. "Do you think we'll ever come back?" Greta asked, gripping the railing as America disappeared beyond the horizon. "Perhaps," Marguerite said, "but not as prisoners, not as enemies. Perhaps someday as friends." It seemed impossible, absurd even. A year ago, such words would have been treason. But the concerts had taught them that impossible things could become real, that enemies could share stages, that humanity could survive even the deepest hatreds. When they arrived in Bremen, the devastation was overwhelming. The Germany they remembered was gone, replaced by a landscape of ruins and hunger. They disembarked into a world of rubble where survivors picked through debris and children begged for scraps. The contrast with America was so stark that some women simply stood on the dock and wept. Marguerite found her mother in a refugee camp outside Dresden. The reunion was bittersweet, joy at survival mixed with grief for all that was lost. Her father and brother were gone, dead in battles that had achieved nothing. Their home was a crater. The piano her mother had played was buried under tons of concrete. That first night, sharing a thin soup in a cramped shelter, Marguerite told her mother about the concerts. Her mother listened with wide eyes, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. "They gave you music," her mother whispered, "while we sat in darkness." "Yes," Marguerite said, "every night. Jazz, classical, folk songs. They treated us like people." Her mother was silent for a long time. Then she said, "We were told they were monsters. We were told they would destroy us." "We were told many things," Marguerite replied quietly. "Most of them were lies." In the months and years that followed, the women scattered across occupied Germany, each carrying their memories of American captivity like secrets too precious and painful to share widely.
Some spoke openly about their experiences, becoming voices for reconciliation and democratic reform. Others buried the memories, unable to reconcile what they had experienced with the shame of defeat. But the music stayed with them. In ruined cities where concert halls had been bombed into dust, some of them gathered in church basements or abandoned buildings to sing. The folk songs they had performed in the camps, the melodies they had heard drifting across Oklahoma nights. These informal concerts became seeds of cultural renewal, reminders that civilization could survive even total war. Marguerite eventually found work as a translator for the American occupation forces. It was controversial. Many saw collaboration with the occupiers as betrayal, but she didn't care. She had learned that the enemy she had been taught to hate understood humanity better than the regime she had served. If working with Americans could help build a better Germany, she would do it without apology. One day in 1948, while working at an American military office in Munich, she heard a familiar sound drifting from a nearby room. Someone playing "I'll Be Seeing You" on a piano. She followed the sound and found Corporal Morrison, now promoted to sergeant, sitting at an old upright, his fingers moving across the keys with the same ease she remembered. He looked up, startled, then broke into a huge grin. "Marguerite, is that really you?" They talked for hours, exchanging stories of the past 2 years. He had returned to America briefly, but volunteered to come back to Germany to help with reconstruction. She told him about finding her mother, about the slow, painful work of rebuilding, about the concerts she had organized in church basements. "Do you still have the notebook I gave you?" he asked. She pulled it from her bag. She carried it everywhere like a talisman. "Every song we heard, every memory." Morrison smiled. "You know what Colonel Hendricks used to say? He said that music was the only weapon that made people more human instead of less. I think he was right." "He was right," Marguerite agreed. "The Reich tried to make us into machines, into tools of ideology. But music reminded us we were people. Even in captivity, especially in captivity, we were more free than we had ever been." It was a paradox that would define the rest of her life. She had been most free when imprisoned, most human when stripped of her nation's identity, most herself when forced to question everything she believed. The concerts in that Oklahoma camp had been more than entertainment. They had been an education in what it meant to be human, to create beauty, to share joy, to recognize the humanity in those who should have been enemies. Years later, in 1965, Margarete attended a concert in the newly rebuilt Berlin Philharmonic Hall. The orchestra performed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with its famous Ode to Joy, a celebration of universal brotherhood. As the chorus sang, "Alle Menschen werden Brüder," all people become brothers, she closed her eyes and remembered. She remembered a cold November night in Oklahoma, stepping off a truck and hearing music instead of cruelty. She remembered the taste of white bread and the glow of electric lights. She remembered Klaus Werner playing Bach, remembered standing on a stage beside Corporal Morrison, remembered Colonel Hendricks telling them to build a nation worthy of their cultural heritage. And she remembered the lesson that had taken a lifetime to fully understand: that civilization is not measured by military might or territorial conquest, but by how we treat those at our mercy. The Americans had held all the power, all the weapons, all the authority. They could have brutalized their prisoners, as the Reich had brutalized so many. Instead, they had given them music. That gift, more powerful than any punishment, more lasting than any indoctrination, had changed everything. It had not erased the guilt of what Germany had done. It had not undone the horror of the Holocaust or the devastation of the war. but it had offered a glimpse of an alternative, a vision of what humanity could be when it chose creation over destruction, when it recognized that even enemies were people who needed music. As the final triumphant notes of Beethoven's Ninth filled the hall, as the audience rose in standing ovation, Margarete felt tears streaming down her face. They were tears of grief for all that had been lost, but also tears of gratitude for what she had found in the unlikeliest place, that in the darkness of defeat, in the depths of captivity, in the silence between enemy lines, music had survived, and with it, hope. The concerts in Camp Gruber had ended decades ago. The stage had been dismantled, the barracks torn down, the prisoners and guards scattered to the winds of history. But the lesson lingered, carried forward by those who had lived it, that the truest victory is not in crushing your enemy, but in showing them a better way. That the most powerful weapon is not hatred, but humanity, and that sometimes the people who defeat you are the ones who teach you how to be free. Margarete carried that lesson until her final days. And when she died in 1989, just weeks before the Berlin Wall fell, her children found among her possessions a battered notebook filled with song titles, concert dates, and a single line written on the final page. They gave us chains, and we expected cruelty. They gave us music, and we discovered freedom. May we never forget the difference. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.